Okay, great. Thank you. So I've been tasked with giving an overview of BIDS, and what I'd like to do is to start a little bit by giving some context and why are we talking about BIDS in the context of GliMR, just introducing a bit more how we see this fitting with the work of Working Group 2. So first of all, I'm not going to go through this GliMR slide again. So you're all there together for this GliMR Hybrid workshop. And in particular, I'd like to talk about what our main goal. So we are here to look at glioma research in Europe. And we know there are about 50,000 new cases of gliomas per year. So this is a big problem that we want to address. But locally, there is a low incidence rate, which unfortunately make our studies often of low sample sizes. And so this has been known for a few years now. This can be an issue for multiple reasons. So I have two really quick examples, not coming from necessarily from the same fields as ours, but that illustrate quite well how these small sample sizes can be an issue. The first one comes from an article that was published in the Atlantic Science, and that was entitled, with quite of a provocative title, A Waste of 1,000 Research Papers. And basically, it was discussing how trying to reproduce a landmark study in genomics, the researchers who tried to reproduce the original results just couldn't when they worked with a bigger sample. And this leads the author to think that the original results was a false positive finding and is one of the illustration of the so-called reproducibility crisis. Of course, this is a problem in research because basically researchers build on each other's work. And if we have a landmark paper that show results, we'd like it to be true so that the following follow-up studies are based on a good basis. Then there is another aspect that we should be more and more careful about, which is algorithmic injustice. So this particular example comes from facial recognition systems. So it was a study a few years back showing that basically commercial systems that were available, were already available, would fail more often when trying to recognize Black women than white men. And looking a little bit deeper into it, it was shown that basically the training data that was used was imbalanced and had a predominant number of white men. And so overall, as a community, sorry, here's my slide, as a community, and this is true, of course, not only in these examples, but in any field using data, we need to create and work on bigger and more representative and diverse data sets. And in order to reach that, one of the ideas with GliMR is that we can come together and share data sets so that together, jointly, we can create bigger data sets. And this brings us to Working Group 2 on multi-site data integration. So as Jan was saying in the introduction, I'm co-leading this working group with Cyril Pernet, who'll talk a bit later. And there we have three main goals for that working group. So the first one was to work on data privacy. And I won't get into the details, but some work has been done in the context of GDPR and making sure that we are able in Europe to share data sets between labs. There is also a focus on data infrastructure, so which database basically are available to us to share this data. But today, when we talk about BIDS, we are really focusing on data portability. So how can we make sure that a data set that is available somewhere can be shared somewhere else and the meaning of the data is preserved? So our goal here is to encode how different acquisition parameters can be conveyed with enough details to support future post-processing in the context of brain tumors. So of course, there might be many directions we take in terms of like modeling, informatics modeling, and this is something we'd like to discuss with you all. Like, what type of data do you think are really crucial for the analysis we want to do in the context of brain tumors, and then we should focus our efforts on that particular data set. As from the get-go, the goal was to work within the context of the international BIDS standard, because it has been going on for a few years now in our community. I'll share more details later on, and this is really well established and quite well accepted by the community, with a global community of more than 200 members. So, but why was BIDS created initially? So we've talked about creating larger data sets, and I think we can go even further than that. So the main advantage of BIDS is that it's going to let you share your data with enough information attached so that it can be reused by someone else. And so BIDS helps sharing and exchanging data, of course, with other labs. But I think we have all seen that if you're in a lab with multiple members, that sometimes it's just really hard to work with the data of like your neighbor, the person who's in the office just next door. So basically BIDS can also help in that context where you're sharing and exchanging data within the lab. And of course, we can go even further. It's also very, very hard to work with yourself, with your past self. So digging back into data that was acquired a few years back, it's often difficult to remember where the different pieces of information were stored. So using BIDS is also a way to have a very standardized way of organizing things so that yourself in 6 months can work with the data again. Another really big advantage is the possibility to create automatic pipelines on top of the data set. This has been extensively done with the BIDS apps. I think a lot of labs before BIDS had their version of BIDS that would work, but this brings it to another level, because basically now we can build automatic pipeline processings that can be shared across labs. Getting a bit more into the detail of BIDS. So it was an effort that initiated from the INCF data sharing task force, and in particular from the Paul Drak lab at Stanford, and more specifically Chris Gorgolewski. There is this first publication that introduced the approach. And so everything started in 2015. So the paper I showed before was really the first release candidate. But since then, BIDS has been extended beyond MRI and fMRI to PET, EEG, MEG, IEG, and so on. And we'll hear a bit more about this later on. So the main idea of BIDS is that, so it's not a new format, it's just a way to organize the data. So it's a directory structure. So here on the left, you have basically your DICOM data set. So it's just a bunch of files. And here on the right are those files organized with BIDS. So we have a folder for the full data set, and then we have subfolders for each subject with the different type of images they can have. So here, anatomical functional diffusion, but of course, as we said, this has been extended beyond now. And then we also have specific files that will include metadata. So for instance, here, metadata about the subjects in the study. So here is a bit more details. The file I was talking about just now, participant.tsv. So for instance, you can have the ID of the participant that corresponds to the folder names, and then an age, and maybe the sex of your subject. And you could add more columns with more information. But I think the main point about BIDS is that beyond the technical challenge of creating a standard, and of course having a standard then enables a lot of tools. So it is creating databases, data transfer, interoperability, good practices, and so on. But I think what's really important about BIDS is the community behind, and not BIDS alone, but I think the research community in general, with hackathons and open science, is going through a culture change, going towards more community-driven research. And BIDS is really an enabler in that context. An enabler because it helps interoperability, but it also helps building new tools that can be created collaboratively across different labs, rather than having just a single lab focusing on the tool. So now about what are we interested in here in this workshop? I think the idea is to propose a BIDS extension. So luckily, BIDS has a mechanism to extend the specification. So it's called the BEPS, for BIDS extension proposals. And basically, so there is a nice graph here that I've just extracted from the BID extension proposals guide. It typically starts with a small groups that writes a complete graph with the extension. Then there is a public call of feedback. So the small group could be a subgroup here in GliMR. Then there is a public call of feedback, hearing about what the larger community has to say about that proposal. And then when a consensus is reached and the validator is updated, basically that new extension can be integrated into BIDS and becomes part of the main standard. So I think that's about all what I wanted to mention here. I wanted to keep the talk really short. I'll just share a link right now in the chat, where Cyril has an example for us with a bit structure that he will be able to discuss a bit more.